Mr. Spock. I offer my services as science officer.
On the 7th of December, 1979, Star Trek came back as a motion picture, and the film that opened that day was not finished. Not in the ordinary sense that a director would have liked more time. Effects shots were incomplete. The sound mix had never properly been done. Sequences that had already been filmed were left out because there was no time to deal with them. Robert Wise, the director, carried the first available print of his own film onto a plane and took it to the premiere in Washington himself. He spent the rest of his life describing what audiences saw that day as a rough cut. His words, not ours. Paramount had a commitment to cinemas for that date that the studio could not move, so the film went out in the state it was in. 22 years later, Wise was given something almost no director is ever given. He went back and finished it, completed the effects that had been abandoned, recut the picture, and gave it the sound mix it never had. And then that version disappeared as well, in a way nobody saw coming. So there are two missing films here. The one that was never completed, and the one that was completed and then became almost impossible to watch. 1. The series that became the film. Star Trek was canceled in 1969 and then did something almost nothing else on television has done. It got bigger after it was over, through years of repeats. By the mid-1970s, Paramount wanted to launch a fourth American television network, and the show meant to anchor it was a new Star Trek series called Phase 2. It was not a pitch. Sets were built. Costumes were made. The Enterprise was redesigned and a new model constructed. A pilot script existed, called In Thy Image. Then, in December of 1977, Paramount abandoned the network. Star Wars had come out that summer and the calculation had changed and converted the pilot episode into a feature film instead. The Phase 2 models were scrapped and the design work started again. 13 episodes of the series had already been written, and Roddenberry kept those scripts on his desk for years afterwards. 2 of them were eventually rewritten as episodes of The Next Generation, more than a decade later. The sets, meanwhile, were not thrown away. They became the foundation of the film's sets, and they stayed on that same soundstage for decades. The film we are talking about is a television pilot that was rebuilt into a motion picture, and the schedule never recovered from that decision. 2. The Vulcan who was meant to replace Spock. Leonard Nimoy did not want to come back, and the reason was not vanity. He was in a legal dispute with Paramount over the studio using his likeness in merchandising and advertising by his own account, including advertisements for liquor without paying him for it. So Phase 2 was designed without Spock in it. A new full Vulcan science officer was written, 22 years old, named Exxon, and an actor called David Gautreaux was cast. He took it entirely seriously. He bought a television set so that he could study the original episodes properly. He sought out an acting coach who had worked with Nimoy to learn how to perform without emotion. He fasted for 10 days. He also began receiving letters from Star Trek viewers, some of which described in detail what they intended to do to the man replacing Spock. And then Nimoy came to terms with Paramount. Robert Wise insisted that Spock be in the film, and Zahn was no longer needed by anybody. 3. The characters they invented in case Kirk left. Exxon was not the only new figure on that bridge. There was a concern inside the production that William Shatner would eventually become too expensive to keep on a weekly series, so a younger executive officer was written specifically as a replacement for Kirk in waiting. His name was Willard Decker, and a navigator was created, a Deltan called Elia, played by Persis Khambatta, who shaved her head for the part. Both of them survived the conversion from television series to feature film. Both are in the finished picture, and both are written out of the story before it ends. What happened to Zahn is stranger still. A revised draft killed him off in a transporter accident in the opening minutes. Gautreaux refused it. Having spent months building the character, he said it was more honorable to remove him altogether than to introduce him and discard him in the same scene. So the character was cut, and Gautreaux was given a small part instead, the commander of the Epsilon 9 station, which is destroyed in the first act. 4. They started shooting without a script. Roddenberry had hired a television writer called Harold Livingston, and the two of them agreed about almost nothing. Livingston has said openly that he wanted the original characters pushed aside and the new ones at the center of the show. Roddenberry rewrote him. Livingston rewrote back. Pages were being produced and replaced while the studio was already booking a release date, and the production went in front of cameras without a completed screenplay. On its own, that is not unheard of. On a film with a fixed release date and large effects sequences, it is close to fatal, because an effects team cannot begin work until it knows what it is being asked to build. Every week the script stayed open, the schedule at the other end got shorter. What happened in December of 1979, with the picture arriving in cinemas carrying shots that had not been finished, was not decided in the cutting room. It was decided at the start, when they began filming a script that did not exist yet. 5. The effects company that was removed. The visual effects were contracted to Robert Abel and Associates, a company with a serious reputation. They were doing things with graphics and animation that almost nobody else could do at the time. Months went by. What came back was not what the production needed. There is an account, recorded in interviews with people who were in the room, of Abel's team showing Wise test footage in which a potato stood in for the Enterprise because the model was not ready. Several of the people interviewed said it was the only occasion they could remember seeing Robert Wise angry. Abel and Associates were taken off the picture. Accounts of exactly why differ. Some describe an inability to deliver on the schedule. Others point to how the budget was being handled, and it is worth saying that plainly, rather than choosing the most dramatic version. What is not in dispute is the position it left the film in. With about a year to release, Star Trek had almost no usable effects footage. 6. The men who were called in to save it. Paramount went to Douglas Trumbull, who had done the effects on 2001 and Close Encounters and had directed Silent Running. Trumbull did not want the job. He was already under contract to Paramount, running his own company, developing high frame rate photography, ride simulators, and other technology, and by his own account, the studio had become so consumed by Star Trek's problems that his projects were being neglected as a result. He took it partly to get the obstacle out of his way. He brought in John Dykstra and the team at Apogee for sequences including the opening Klingon encounter and the destruction of the Epsilon 9 station. And Trumbull rebuilt the way the ship itself was lit. On the television series, the Enterprise had been lit flat, with a key and a fill, the way television was shot. For a feature, it had to look like the star of the picture. All of that had to happen inside the time that was left, which was not enough. 7. The score written before the film existed. Jerry Goldsmith was brought in with roughly 4 months left before release, and had to begin recording within about one of them. He was scoring to footage that in many cases was not there yet, sequences still being built, shots still being rendered. He wrote a main theme. Robert Wise rejected it, telling him it sounded too nautical. Goldsmith wrote another. A great deal of the first recording was thrown away. The theme went through several versions before the one everybody knows took shape, and that theme then outlived the film completely. 9 years later, it became the opening titles of Star Trek, The Next Generation, and it is now what most people hear in their heads when you say the words Star Trek. Goldsmith also asked not to use Alexander Courage's original television fanfare anywhere in the picture. And for V'ger, he reached for an instrument almost nobody had heard, the blaster beam, a long aluminium bar strung with amplified metal wires, built and played by Craig Huxley. He was nominated for an Academy Award. He wrote most of it blind. 8. The 7th of December. The date could not move. Paramount had committed the film to cinemas, and the cost of missing it would have been enormous. So everything downstream was compressed into whatever was left. Effects shots were arriving in the cutting room in the final weeks, some of them so late that there was no real opportunity to judge them in the context of the film around them. There was no time for a proper final sound mix. There was no time to reconsider the edit. Wise flew to Washington with the print. The picture had cost around $44 million, and it took roughly $139 million worldwide, less than Paramount had hoped for. But enough that they immediately commissioned a cheaper sequel. Reviews were mixed, and the recurring complaint was that the film was slow and leaned too heavily on its effects. Some of that slowness was deliberate. Some of it was an edit that nobody had been allowed to finish. 9. What unfinished actually looked like. This is worth making concrete because unfinished is a word that can mean almost anything. There is a sequence in which Kirk puts on a spacesuit to go after Spock inside Voyager. It was shot, and in the version that was later restored, you can see on screen that the set itself had not been completed. Elsewhere, shots meant to carry the sense of scale simply were not there. The color timing is inconsistent from sequence to sequence because there was no time to balance it. And several passages that had been filmed were left out of the release altogether, not because anyone judged them to be weak, but because finishing them was not possible inside the schedule. That is what a rough cut in a cinema looks like, not a scandal, an arithmetic problem, printed and projected. 10. 22 years later, in 2001, two people who had worked with Wise's production company, David Fain and Michael Matessino, pushed Paramount to let him go back to it. Wise was reportedly reluctant at first. He was in his late 80s and the film had been out for 2 decades. He agreed. What he made runs about 136 minutes, 4 minutes longer than the release version. Some scenes were trimmed or removed, others reinstated. The effects that had been abandoned in 1979 were finally completed using computer animation, with the original physical model of the Enterprise brought out of storage so it could be studied and matched. And for the first time, the film was given a proper final sound mix. Wise said afterwards that it was an opportunity he had never believed would come. He had made the film twice, 22 years apart, and only the second time with the tools he needed. 11. And then it vanished again. Here is the part that turns the story over. The director's edition was released on home video only, and only in standard definition. That included the new effects, which had been rendered at that resolution because that was what the release required. Which means that when high definition arrived a few years later, the finished version of the film could not come with it. There was no master to scale up. For roughly 20 years, the only way to watch Robert Wise's completed Star Trek was in a format that had already been superseded. While the unfinished 1979 release moved onto every new disc and every new service without difficulty, Wise died in 2005. Fain and Matessino kept working at it, and the effects had to be built again from the beginning at higher resolution. The 4K version finally arrived in 2022, 43 years after release, 21 years after Wise finished the film, and 17 years after his death. 12. The man who lost the thing he made. Gene Roddenberry spent 10 years trying to get Star Trek back. He lobbied Paramount after the cancellation in 1969. He kept the idea alive through the years of repeats. He built Phase 2. He produced the film. And when the film came in at around $44 million, with mixed reviews and a return the studio considered disappointing, Paramount drew its conclusion and removed him from creative control of the sequel. The Wrath of Khan was made by other people for a fraction of the money, and it is the film most audiences now name as the best of them. Roddenberry was kept on with a consulting credit. He did not run a Star Trek production again until The Next Generation, nearly a decade later, and he died in 1991. The franchise he spent 10 years rescuing has now run for another 45 years. The unfinished film is the reason it survived at all, and it is also the reason the man who rescued it was moved out of the way. There is no villain in this one either. Paramount had a date it could not move and a film that was not ready. Robert Wise delivered what could be delivered and was honest about it for the rest of his life. And the same studio then paid twice to let him finish, once in 2001, and again long after he was gone. Wise made 2 other films that this channel has already covered: The Day the Earth Stood Still and The Sound of Music. Both of those reached audiences complete. This is the one that did not, and it is the only one he was ever allowed to go back for. The missing frame is not always something that was taken out. Sometimes it is something that never got put in. And the strange part of this story is that it eventually was put in, 22 years late, by the man who had wanted to do it all along and then went missing all over again, for a reason nobody had thought to worry about. A film can be rescued and lost twice. This one managed both. If you would like more of these, subscribe.